Hi there, I'm Marissa Evangelista, a gallery assistant at MFA, and now I'll be introducing Jeff Markowsky. Jeff is a plein air artist who has won several prizes at various plein air competitions. After departing from his academic studies, he began his nomadic life as the Plein Air Nomad in 2022. Jeff expresses that plein air painting as a natural joy for him as it combines his childhood passions for painting and love for nature into one. He also states, for me, this is a very similar thing to meditation, only with a very tangible result, that of the final expression, the painting itself.
Okay, well, thank you, Marissa. And more importantly, thank you, Jeff, for agreeing to participate. Uh, I'm Will Scott. If you've been watching Will Talks, you know who I am, and I'm not really the feature of these events. It's the artist. So let's jump right in with Jeff, who is a transplanted Canadian. In fact, he lived on the western plains of Canada. That's where he grew up, and now he's been living for quite a while in Savannah, Georgia. So, Jeff, what provoked you to come to the States and then remain for so long?
First, just thanks for having me, both of you. It's an honor to be here, and I really look forward to visiting Annapolis. What first brought me to the States was to study graduate school. At the time, I was studying to be an illustrator, and I was at the Alberta College of Art in Calgary for 4 years studying visual communications, which was basically some commercial art. And decided to, and was fortunate to get into the School of Visual Arts in New York to their MFA as illustration program. Moved to New York, was there for about 4 years, 5 years, I guess, in total, before the school in New York actually was opening a branch campus down here in Savannah. And I was fortunate to get the opportunity to come and teach. And that's how I ended up in Savannah.
Yeah, well, that's a wonderful school. I mean, I've only been there twice to visit, but great talented faculty and students, and I love seeing the exhibits of the students' work when I am there. So anybody who's listening and doesn't know about the Savannah College of Art, and you're going that way, make a stop. How is it that you are the sort of traveling plein air painter? What made you do that? How did you find that you could do that?
Let's see. I started plein air painting really in my when I lived in Canada. In the summers, I would take some classes or workshops with some local painters, and really always felt in touch with nature. Grew up with my father canoeing, and spent a lot of time camping and backpacking, things like that, fishing. When I moved to New York, studying illustration and visiting really the museums for the first time, and falling in love with Velasquez and some of the Ashcan school painters like Hopper and Robert Henry, etc. The
Henry.
Yeah, some real beautiful. Like I really wanted to learn how to paint, and I had a pretty good foundation in drawing, and so the Art Students League was beckoning, and that's where I met Frank Mason, Gregory Crane, who was one of his students, and in the summers they would go to Vermont for a month and do plein air painting, and so that was kind of the bug where I really kind of started to do it a lot. And when I was in Savannah, I would do it when I could in the summers, being that I was teaching a lot, sometimes on the weekends. And I was fortunate to get a sabbatical award in fellowship. I'm trying to think, it was 2014. So I had essentially 6 months off to travel and paint. So I wrote up my sabbatical as essentially immersing myself into some of the history of plein air painting, traveling out west, made an incredible adventure out of it. And that's really where it caught a hold of me, is like, this is how I want to spend the rest of my life.
What you just told us about your background and looking at your website, you certainly have studied at some of the art schools in America and in Canada that are very strong and have very strong reputations. And when you mentioned Robert Henry, some things fell into place for me. My dissertation advisor was the world's leading expert on Robert Henry's art.
Wow.
And I can really see now what I was going to ask you about, because I had this sort of gut feeling based on looking at just a few examples of your work. This is one of two similar paintings that you've chosen to share with our viewers. Just a quick aside, The reason that we're doing Will Talks right now, focused on juried artists in the Paint Annapolis event, is that it's our biggest event of the year in every respect. And we invite painters from all over the world, really, if they would like to submit for our juror. And then those that are chosen come to Annapolis for about 2 weeks. Very energetic plein air painting. And I have to say that you really are one of the artists that is new to me. And I think this is your first time at Paint Annapolis. Yeah.
Correct.
And I'm really looking forward to seeing more of your work and seeing you at work, because um, just as we discovered that I had a connection from the art historical side to a painter, Robert Henry, that influenced you. This is the kind of landscape painting that Henry and many of his group would do. And what I mean by that, from the art historical point of view, is that you have a lot of very firm, confident brush strokes, and you've built up your painting with very solid forms. To a casual observer, the term impressionism, because of some of the broken color and the visible brushwork, might come to mind, but it's not really that. It's a different approach to landscape. In fact, Henry and his circle and artists all over America, and I think what I do know of Canadian art at the same time, would often praise a work like this by saying, well, this is a big painting, or referring to the artist as a big man because of the forcefulness of the brushwork and the sort of solidity of the composition. Does that make any sense to you, Jeff, or would you like to walk me off of that?
No, thank you for sharing that. That I've never actually heard of that, but as you were describing the painting and some of the history and the references, as you said, big painting, the word that came to my mind was massing. Like the Art Students League, which Robert Henry is obviously such a historical big part of. And my teacher there, Frank Mason, used to talk about Robert Henry, and he used to talk about the strength of masses, the
Yes.
simplicity of shapes.
Yep.
The art spirit covers a lot of that, his writings.
Yes. Yep.
So yeah, you're right on target, and I think I'm very inspired by Impressionism. So yeah, that all lends itself well to a lot of my sensibilities.
Well, let's move on to the next image because it's similar. Is this exactly the same viewpoint?
It's the same place, yes, and essentially I did a large scale painting of that. It's actually behind me. It's about 5 by 6+ feet in scale, of that same area, except it wasn't painted plein air. So I did this in the studio from the painting that you just saw, as well as some photographs. But in truth, the photographs were supplemental and not necessary, if anything.
So you've just described the traditional approach. Once plein air painting became widespread and accepted in the academic shows and the commercial galleries of the time, found a following among patrons. A lot of the artists had been taught to work by going out of doors, but finishing the composition in the studio. In fact, they used a little they often use little wooden canvas, not canvas, supports, matrices, and those were called pochades. You're really steeped in some of the major traditions and movements of the late 19th century in North American art. Are you conscious of that? Do you see yourself as upholding a certain tradition approach to landscape?
It's interesting. Well, I don't think about that, but as we're talking, I'm really becoming very grateful for my training, and it goes way back to the Art Students League, which was so immersed in. Frank Mason's always talked about his teacher Frank Dumont, who was a student of Whistler, and I mean, you look at that tradition, it goes.
Yeah, yeah.
And the other thing that just came to mind as you mentioned big, I think you said big painters was and the boldness. George Bellows was one of my
Oh, yeah.
he's one of my favorite painters, and I don't get to paint on like he does, but like that's somebody that I really admire in terms of and was a part of that sort of periphery of the Ashcan school.
Yeah. Well, here's two sort of sidebars, and you've led me right to it. that I wanted to ask you about, even though we don't have images for viewers to look at. On your website, you have some wonderful figure drawings. I mean, you're very accomplished as a artist representing the human figure.
Thank
So
you.
why have you chosen to concentrate almost exclusively, or maybe exclusively, on landscape painting when you're so capable in that other realm?
That's a really good question, and I really appreciate it because it's timely. I taught figure drawing at the college here in Savannah for about 15 years, and slowly it really happened before COVID, sort of segued into online teaching, which I didn't like to teach light drawing on. And I have a passion for it. I love working with the human body and the figure and the portrait. Back in 14, when I took that sabbatical, my goal was really to just get in touch with nature. And I think that fascination with hiking,
Mhm.
being outdoors kind of played into obviously working with the landscape, but I always had the intention of going back to the figure. And funny enough, I'm actually going to be teaching and working with the figure back in Austin this fall at a small atelier there. So I'm really excited about that. And I
Yeah,
really
yeah,
feel that if you can work with the figure, trees, nature, all of that stuff has that life force dwelling within it. So it all
yeah.
parallels.
Yeah, I like the way that you mentioned the life force, because certainly your landscapes and the approach to the landscape that has this bolder aspect captures, to me at least, that life
Thank you.
force.
Yeah, appreciate that. That's a wonderful compliment.
One last aside, again, we don't have the images, but some of the images of the human figures on your website seem to be affected by the way the surrealists approach art in general and the human figure. I mean, they're not classical nudes.
Just to reference what you must be looking at the kind of the narrative portraits, the multiple portraits.
The ones with a couple of figures in them, and
Yeah,
I couldn't quite tell what it was they were doing together.
yeah. I would say, so in terms of the surrealism, probably not. Like that's not something I necessarily, although I understand that I'm
Uh,
not really associated with it. Those were a little off on a different tangent in terms of my interest in psychology, personalities, and the figure, of course,
yeah,
application of paint, capturing a personality in a painting in more than one moment. I
yes.
find that portraiture can become very static.
Well,
Yeah.
you might know what Whistler said about it as an explanation for why he quit. A portrait is a painting about which there is something always wrong with the mouth. A portraiture, for a painter, I know, is I can see how difficult it is. Well, let's go on to your more recent work. Am I safe in saying this is more or less the manner, style you'll be employing during Paint Annapolis? So we're sort of getting a little preview as we look at these images.
Yeah, these three next paintings are all done within the last year or two. This was done in New Bern at a plein air event last year, about this time actually. And yeah, that's a painting done over 2 sessions and relatively spontaneous. Yeah, pretty much
Well,
how I
for a
work.
spontaneous plein air effort, I'm struck after hearing you say that the water has a real physical presence to it. A lot of plein air paintings are beautiful, but yet they're a little amorphous, a little lacking in substance. Is this a deliberate creative act on your part, or is this just the way the light and the color of the water and the movement of the water, the way you depicted it that day?
No, it was quite deliberate. I actually really find water to be one of the most difficult things to paint, and I think there was some, for me, success in this because of that.
Yeah.
Like it had a feeling for the reflection, some of the movement, but yeah, it was quite deliberate and hopefully not overworked. And like I said, it was
No.
done in 2 sessions, so there was a little bit of underpainting showing, etc.
When you reference the underpainting, then it really clicked in, and now I'm going to, I hope, do my last, if I can control myself, art historical note. This is the way that a lot of the painters around Henry painted water, and leaving a little bit of the underpainting coming through, and the water seems to be substantive, but it's in motion at the same time. I mean, I really, this is like a landscape painting by Henry and the Eight.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's wonderful. I appreciate that. Yeah. You know, Enright talked a lot about that energy and the life force, which really originated with like Da Vinci, but he was big on capturing gesture.
Now, you've lived in Savannah for what, 15 years or so, you said, or maybe a little
About
longer?
26 years altogether.
I was born about 70 miles away from Savannah, and lived there until I was 5 in Georgia, and went back for a few more years while my maternal grandparents were still living, and visited their farm. So I mean, this just brought me up short, because I think it's hard for a painter to capture the atmosphere of that part of the United States. You know, it's damp, it's heavy, it's moist. Painting Spanish moss as you have here is just really hard to do. And but anyway, I love the way that you framed the road and the brighter area as the road progresses out more into an open area. So is this more typical of what you'll be doing next month when you come to Annapolis, in terms of the palette and the brushwork? You know, it's a little lighter, a little more broken up than the paintings that we've been looking at, your earlier work.
Yeah, this is a recent painting that I did at the Bonaventure Cemetery, one of my favorite places to paint. And thank you for the compliments, by the way. And I love a challenge. And if you, growing up where you described, standing amongst this kind of foliage and landscape is overwhelming. And it's always been something. I've actually painted this scene at least 6 times. And it just keeps getting more interesting, and trying to find ways to do it. And I feel that this was really one of my more successful, not just in the end result, but really enjoyed painting it, putting the paint down.
It's one of those rare occasions where somebody who's visiting us and participating for the first time, and so I don't know you, I don't know your work in advance, but I know this place, and I've been in the cemetery, and yeah, I mean, you did it. You knocked it out of the park.
Thank you. Appreciate
so
that.
I'm really looking forward to seeing your work here. The light sand in the foreground, and the blue water in the marshes. You must know the famous poem, The Marshes of Glen.
I don't think so.
Look it up. I should remember the name of the poet, but it's very famous. And you go to the State of Georgia website, I think you would find it. So I think it's Henry Lanier, The Marshes of Glen. Very descriptive of all the kinds of things that we've been talking about, that you've been putting into your paintings. It's funny. My grandfather's farm was out in the country, and was a very modest farm at that. But you know, every time you come to an open space along the road, there's a palm tree. Even back when I was a child in the 50s, which is, of course, not, those palms are not native. I think there's one kind of scrubby little palm that's native. So just beautiful. This is a very fine painting. Sometimes Marissa has interesting questions. You have anything you want to ask today, Marissa?
Well, I'm curious to know your favorite place you've painted at, if you have any. I'm sure there's so many, but I'd be very curious to know, since you're constantly on the road.
Well, to be honest with you, Marissa, the 2 that I put in here, that place on the gorge in Bonaventure Cemetery, are probably up in the top 3. If there was another place, it would be the Pacific Coast, anywhere along California coast, like from Big Sur to Point Lobos and Garapata State Park. In between that place, if I could live there, that's probably where I'd end up.
A good question, as usual, Marissa. And so let's wrap up by just this one little bit. You've not been to the Annapolis area before, or you've not been here to paint before?
I've been through there, but I've never been there to paint, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the landscape and the town. And I heard there's a good harbor with boats. And
yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things that makes Paint Annapolis a successful event for the Maryland Federation of Art, and for the artists, and for the community that engage with the artists, because there's so many people like yourself, very fine painters, who haven't been here before. And there's always that little, don't you think, the little extra energy?
Absolutely.
It sounds like you travel to hook into that.
Exactly.
that's one of the great things about Paint Annapolis, bringing people here for the first time and seeing how they what they create. Jeff, thanks for your time. Looking forward to meeting you and seeing your work here in Annapolis. And Marissa, as usual, thanks for your excellent support for the Will Talks.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Great questions. I look forward to meeting you and all of the other great artists that are going to be at the event and seeing all the